Before electricity, when night fell, people heard voices in the darkness, not metaphors. Not folklore, but real voices, and what they said could get you killed. Imagine this, it's 1347, midnight in Prague, you're lying on a straw mattress. And through your window, no glass, just a wooden shutter, you hear it. A whisper, clear and distinct, calling your name. Your heart stops because in medieval Europe, hearing voices after dark wasn't just terrifying, it was evidence that could see you tortured, drowned, or burned alive by morning. Tonight, we're descending into one of history's most chilling phenomena. Night voices, the whispers, screams, and phantom conversations that haunted humanity for thousands of years before we understood what darkness really was. This isn't about ghost stories, this is about psychology, survival, and the brutal reality of living when night meant isolation, danger, and a world that transformed into something unrecognizable. You're about to discover why entire villages went mad after dark, why people stopped speaking after sunset, and why some cultures believed that to answer a voice in the darkness was to forfeit your soul. Welcome to Vespertine Era, where the night reveals what daylight buries. Let's begin. Here's what most people don't understand about pre-electric darkness. It wasn't dim, it wasn't shadowy, it was absolute. When the sun disappeared, human vision collapsed to nearly nothing. Your eyes, evolved for daylight, could barely detect shapes beyond 5 feet, but your ears became razor-sharp. Scientists now know that in complete darkness, the human brain overcompensates. Your auditory cortex literally expands its processing power, and you hear things with supernatural clarity: the crack of a branch 100 yards away, the rustle of fabric, the distant howl of wind through cracks in stone. But here's the nightmare: your brain also starts filling in gaps. Psychologists call it pareidolia, the tendency to perceive patterns where none exist in darkness. Every creak becomes a footstep. Every gust of wind becomes a whisper. Your own breathing echoes back as something other. And in medieval Europe, when you heard your name called from the darkness outside your window, there was no way to know if it was real. But what if I told you that sometimes it was real? 13th century England, rural villages scattered across foggy moorlands after sunset. A practice emerged that sounds like something from a horror film: the night callers. These were criminals, thieves, murderers, raiders who weaponized the darkness. They would circle isolated farmhouses after midnight, positioned just beyond visibility, and call out the names of people inside. Thomas ... Thomas, open the door. Margaret, your husband sent me, let me in. They gathered names from local markets, taverns, church records, they studied routines. And when night fell, they used those names as keys. Historical records from Nottinghamshire describe a farmer named William Thatcher who heard his deceased brother's voice calling him outside. He opened the door and they found his body 3 days later, stripped of everything, throat cut, left in a ditch. The night callers understood something profound. In darkness, trust becomes a weapon. But the human predators weren't even the worst part. By the 14th century, hearing voices after dark became evidence of witchcraft. The Catholic Inquisition documented thousands of cases across Europe. People who claimed to hear their names whispered, who heard conversations in empty rooms, who swore they heard dead relatives speaking through walls. The Church's conclusion was demonic possession. In Toulouse, France, 1335, a woman named Beatrice de l'Église was arrested for consorting with night demons. Her crime was telling her priest she heard beautiful singing outside her window every night at 2 a.m., singing in a language she didn't recognize. She described it in her testimony, like angels, but wrong, like the notes were bent. She was tortured for 6 days, confessed to witchcraft, and burned at the stake in front of 3,000 people. Historians now believe she was experiencing musical hallucinations, a documented phenomenon where the brain generates phantom sounds and sensory deprivation. Her demonic singing was likely her own mind trying to process silence. But in 1335, that explanation didn't exist, and 3,000 people watched her die for hearing something that wasn't there. Yet across the ocean, another culture had a completely different explanation for night voices, and their solution was far more disturbing. Northern Canada, Algonquian territories. Winter 1661, French Jesuit missionaries recorded something they called la folie de la nuit, the madness of night. Indigenous communities described a phenomenon. During the brutal winter months, when darkness lasted 16 hours and temperatures dropped to lethal levels, people would hear screams in the forest. Not animal screams, but human screams, screaming their names, begging for help. The Algonquian people had a rule: never answer, never investigate, never leave your shelter, because those voices they believed belonged to the Wendigo, a malevolent spirit that mimicked human voices to lure victims into the frozen darkness. Once you stepped outside to help, you vanished. Your body would be found weeks later, if at all. Here is what makes this chilling. Missionaries documented 17 cases of people disappearing after answering the night voices in just one winter season. Modern researchers now understand this was likely a combination of auditory hallucinations from extreme cold and isolation, genuine predators like wolves and bears whose sounds were misinterpreted, and disoriented, dying travelers whose actual calls for help went fatally answered. But imagine being in that longhouse, hearing your child's voice screaming for you from the darkness, knowing that opening the door could mean death, but not opening it could mean abandoning them. That psychological torture? Europe was about to experience it on a mass scale. 1348, the Black Death reaches London as the plague ravaged Europe. A new horror emerged. The sounds of the dying echoing through empty streets after dark. Cities implemented strict curfews. After sunset, no one was permitted outside. The sick were locked in their homes with doors marked with red crosses. And at night, from behind those doors came the voices, moaning, crying, screaming for help, begging for water. City records describe night watchmen going insane within weeks. These were men hired to patrol streets after dark, ensuring curfew compliance, but what they encountered broke them. One watchman's account from Norwich describes walking past a plague house and hearing a woman's voice, "Please, please, I'm not sick anymore. Let me out, my children are in there, please." He stood outside that door for an hour. Paralyzed protocol forbade opening plague houses, but her voice sounded so rational, so sane. He walked away, and by morning she was dead. Historians estimate that during the worst plague years, night watchmen had a mental breakdown rate of nearly 60%. Many abandoned their posts. Some killed themselves, and the psychological weight of hearing thousands die in darkness unable to help shattered them. But there was one group of people who couldn't walk away from the night voices, and their stories are the darkest of all. 19th century, the age of lighthouses. These isolated towers, surrounded by miles of ocean, housed keepers who worked alone for months at a time, and they reported something consistent. Voices in the storm, not wind, not waves, but voices. The most famous case, Flannan Isles Lighthouse, Scotland, 1903 keepers stationed there. And on December 26th, a supply ship arrived to find the lighthouse abandoned. Doors open, table set for a meal, clock stopped, no bodies, no signs of struggle. But the final log entry, written by head keeper James Duckett, read, "Storm of unprecedented violence. All three of us heard them calling, praying God it stops." They were never found. Modern lighthouse keepers, yes, some still exist, report the same phenomenon. When storms hit, when the wind reaches a certain pitch, the human brain interprets it as voices screaming, laughing, calling your name. One keeper interviewed in 2019 described it this way: "You know it's the wind, you understand the science, but at 3 a.m., when you're alone, and you hear your dead mother's voice calling you to come outside, knowing doesn't help. So if the voices aren't real, why do we still hear them? Because here's the truth. We never stopped hearing night voices. Sleep paralysis affects 8% of the population regularly, and the most common hallucination is voices. Urban explorers report hearing conversations in abandoned buildings. Solo hikers describe hearing their names called from empty trails, and night shift workers in hospitals, prisons, warehouses all report the same thing. When you're alone in darkness, the voices come. Reddit is filled with thousands of accounts, security guards, truck drivers, insomniacs, all describing the same experience. Hearing something human in the darkness that shouldn't be there. The difference between us and our ancestors? We have light switches, we have smartphones, we have scientific explanations. But turn off every light in your house tonight, sit in absolute darkness for 30 minutes, and tell me you don't hear something, because the night hasn't changed, only our ability to escape it has. So what were the night voices? Hallucinations born from sensory deprivation, predators exploiting fear, actual people crying for help misinterpreted as something supernatural? The answer is all of it and none of it, because the most terrifying part isn't what caused the voices. It's the decision they force people to make. Do you trust what you hear? Do you open the door? Do you step into darkness to help someone who might not exist, or who might be exactly what you fear? For thousands of years that choice killed people, the ones who answered died, the ones who didn't died inside. And maybe that's why these stories haunt us, because we recognize the cruelty of it, the impossible choice between compassion and survival. The night hasn't stopped speaking, we've just gotten better at not listening. But every once in a while, on a dark road, in an empty house, in that moment between sleeping and waking, you'll hear it. Your name, whispered, just beyond the light. And you'll have to decide, do you answer? This is Vespertine Era, where the night is never just the night. If this story pulled you into the darkness, subscribe. Because every week we're exploring the hidden world that only exists after sunset, the crimes, the history, the mysteries that daylight buries. Drop a comment. Have you ever heard something in the darkness you couldn't explain? Share your story. Let's see how many of us have heard the voices. And remember, when night falls and you hear your name called from the shadows, don't answer. See you in the darkness.